penmanship might be a good exercise to begin a quiet afternoon. You call it cursive writing. And paper was used mainly for penmanship. Until the 1840s, scholars practiced with ink and quills, which were actually goose feathers. Later, scholars practiced with steel tip pens that they dipped into ink bottles. Paper was much too expensive for everyday lessons, so students wrote their lessons on slates. The student slates were smaller versions of those blackboards that you found on the walls. Slate pencils that they wrote with were made of clay or a softer stone called soapstone. Slates could be erased over and over again with an old rag as scholars finished their lessons. And since slate was rock, it never wore out and there was never any waste at all. School books of the time were very scarce, so children had to bring their own books from home. They might even have to borrow books from a neighbor or a cousin or someone who had graduated from the 8th grade. The teacher never had a whole set of books for the class. In fact, she probably never had matching books for any grade or subject. The books were tiny in size, and they were used over and over and over until they were almost worn out. The question is often asked how that one teacher could control all those ages and all those grades in that small space. Well, children were expected to be on their best behavior in those one-room schools, even though the teacher had a hard job to teach them all. They were polite and they knew their manners. They addressed their teacher like this: "Yes, ma'am," and "No, ma'am," or "Yes, sir," and "No, sir." The number one rule was no whispering, and scholars had to remain busy and quiet on their seat work all day long. But if there was some issue in that classroom about behavior, teachers were allowed to punish scholars who did not heed warnings to behave in class, and parents supported the efforts of the teachers to be good disciplinarians. Teachers were very creative in their methods of discipline in the schoolhouse. There were those who would keep you in from nooning time, but remember, that was a whole hour while your friends were out at play. And others might make you write over and over and over on the board what you had done wrong and what your promise was to be a better student. So now that you have a fairly good idea about life in a one-room school, you certainly might enjoy practicing some lessons that they used in those days. So maybe you'll give it a try when you meet up with your school marm. She'll share stories and materials from the days gone by of life in a one-room school. She'll have you reading in an 1800s reader, writing on slate boards, and dipping your pens in ink to do your cursive writing. Now until that day, remember to mind your manners and address your teacher, "Yes, ma'am," and "No, ma'am," and "Yes, sir," and "No, sir."